The morning my lawyer walked into my youngest son's kitchen and laid a folder on that scratched-up table, I watched 67 years of choices play out on the faces of my older sons in about 4 seconds flat. That moment, I'd been building toward it for 3 weeks without fully understanding why. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this really started, because the ending only means something if you understand what came before it. My name is Harold Whitfield. I spent 41 years as a civil engineer, then another 12 quietly buying and holding real estate across 3 states. I never talked about money. My late wife, Carol, used to say I kept my cards so close to my chest that even she needed a flashlight to read them sometimes. She passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to funeral. After that, I rattled around our house in Charlotte for about a year before I started to feel the walls closing in. Not from grief, exactly grief I could manage, but from something harder to name. Invisibility, maybe. The sense that the world had sorted me into a category called done. My 3 sons were grown and scattered. My oldest, Patrick, was a cardiologist in Atlanta with a house that looked like a hotel lobby and a wife who collected friends the way some people collect furniture for appearance, not comfort. My middle son, Greg, had landed in New York doing something in finance that I never entirely understood, but that paid him enough to lease a penthouse on the Upper East Side and take vacations to places I had to look up on a map. And then there was Danny, my youngest, 34 years old, living in a 2-bedroom house in Asheville, North Carolina, with his wife, Lori, working as a licensed plumber for a small outfit that served residential customers mostly. He drove a truck with a dent above the rear wheel well that had been there since the previous owner. He and Lori didn't take vacations. They had a vegetable garden in the backyard and a dog named Biscuit, who was mostly beagle and entirely ridiculous. I loved all 3 of my sons. I want to be clear about that because what I'm about to tell you could sound like I'd already written Patrick and Greg off before the experiment even started. I hadn't. I was genuinely hoping to be wrong about what I suspected. Here's what I suspected, that somewhere along the way, in giving my older 2 boys every advantage I could afford, private schools, college tuition paid in full, first apartment deposits, the down payment on Patrick's house, I had taught them something I never intended to teach. I had taught them that money was the medium through which love moved, that if you needed something, you asked for it in dollars, and if you had enough dollars, you didn't need anything else. I didn't know when exactly that lesson had taken hold, but I could feel it in the phone calls that came every birthday and Christmas and almost never in between. I could feel it in the way Patrick talked to me at Carol's funeral, organized, appropriate, efficient, like I was a patient he needed to stabilize before his next appointment. Danny had called me every Sunday for the past 4 years. Not always for long, sometimes just 10 minutes, but every Sunday, without fail, he called. I started thinking about the test in February. By March, I had convinced myself it was a terrible idea. By April, I'd hired a private mailbox service and started laying the groundwork. I told myself I needed to know. I told myself that Carol would have done the same thing. I told myself a lot of things. Mostly, I think I was lonely in a way I didn't have language for, and I needed to find out whether the family I had given my whole working life to building was real. I am not proud of every part of what followed. I want you to know that. I called Patrick first. It was a Tuesday in early May, just after 7 in the evening. I told him I had something serious to share. I told him that a combination of bad investment decisions and a legal dispute over a property had wiped out most of my liquid savings. I told him my bank had begun foreclosure proceedings on the Charlotte house. I kept my voice steady because I am a man who has kept his voice steady through things far worse than a phone call. I told him I had about 3 weeks before I needed to be out, and I wasn't sure where I was going. There was a pause on his end. A long one. I could hear Atlanta traffic somewhere behind him, which meant he was probably pulling into his driveway. "Dad," he said, and there was something in the way he said it careful, like he was about to deliver a diagnosis that's really serious. "Have you talked to a financial advisor? Because there are options before foreclosure, actually." I told him I had talked to everyone I could think of. I told him the situation was what it was. Another pause. "The thing is," he said, "we really don't have the space right now. The guest room is becoming Melissa's home office starting next month, and she's already got the painters booked. And honestly, with my schedule, Dad, I don't think I could give you what you'd need. I think you'd be better served in a structured environment. There are some really good senior living communities near Charlotte. I can have my office manager send you some information. Senior living communities. I was 67 years old and had walked 14 miles the previous weekend. But I thanked him and said I'd look into it and got off the phone and sat in my kitchen for a while looking at nothing. I called Greg 2 days later. I used almost the same words. Greg processed information faster than Patrick. It was a Wall Street thing. I suppose so. His response came quicker. God, Dad, that's rough. Listen, I'd say come stay with us, but honestly, the building has really strict guest policies. And Victoria's got her book club using the second bedroom every Thursday, and I travel so much right now that you'd basically be alone in a strange apartment. I don't think that's good for you. A brief pause. I can wire you some money to get you through the next couple months while you figure something out. Would that help? I asked him how much he was thinking. I could do 500, maybe 1,000 if you really need it. Out of a year-end bonus I happened to know had been well into 6 figures. But I thanked him and said I appreciated it and got off the phone. I drove to Asheville on a Friday, late in the afternoon, and I did not call ahead. I drove the kind of car that fit the story I was telling my old 2009 Civic that I'd kept in the garage for years out of a sentiment I couldn't entirely explain. I parked 2 streets over, and I walked to Danny's house with a single duffel bag, and I knocked on the door. Danny answered in work clothes, still had grease on his hands from something he'd been fixing in the backyard. He looked at me. He looked at the bag. He looked at my face, which I had not arranged into anything, which I had just let be whatever it was. Dad, he said. What happened? I told him the same story I'd told his brothers. Slower this time, because Danny listened slower. Not because he was less smart, but because he was the kind of person who listened with his whole body, who needed a moment to take something in before he responded. When I finished, he was quiet for about 5 seconds. Then he said, "Come inside." Just that. Come inside. Laurie was in the kitchen making something that smelled like garlic and tomato. She was 29 weeks pregnant with their first child, moving around that small kitchen with the particular careful efficiency of a woman who had rearranged her entire relationship to her own body to accommodate another life. When Danny told her what was happening, she put down her spoon and looked at me and said, "Of course you're staying here, Harold. We'll figure it out. We'll figure it out." Not let me check the calendar. Not for how long exactly. Just, we will figure it out. They gave me their bedroom. I told them, absolutely not. Danny told me, absolutely yes. And he said it with enough quiet finality that I understood the conversation was over. They moved to the pull-out couch in the living room. Laurie, 29 weeks pregnant, slept on a pull-out couch so that her father-in-law could have a real mattress. I lay in their bedroom that first night listening to the house settle and to Biscuit padding around the hallway, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not validation. Not the grim satisfaction of having proven a hypothesis. Something closer to shame. And something else, something that felt almost like being known. I need to tell you about the 4th day. Because that's the day the story changed for me in a way I hadn't anticipated. I had told Danny I was essentially out of cash. He hadn't questioned it. On the morning of the 4th day, I came into the kitchen and found Laurie sitting at the table with a small wooden box open in front of her. In the box were her grandmother's pearl earrings. She had shown them to me once before, on the Christmas after she and Danny got married, held them out in her palm the way you hold something that isn't really yours, something that has been passed through hands you never got to hold. Her grandmother had emigrated from South Korea at 22 years old with almost nothing, and those earrings were almost nothing, and somehow that made them everything. Laurie was turning them over in her fingers when I walked in. She looked up and saw my face, and her expression shifted into something casual, something she'd prepared. "I've been meaning to take these to a jeweler anyway," she said. "Get them properly cleaned. The setting on the left one has always been a little loose. I am 67 years old. I have been lied to kindly before. I know exactly what it looks like." I sat down across from her and I said, "Laurie, what are you doing?" She held my eyes for a moment and then looked back at the earrings. "We're a little tight this week," she said, quietly. "The furnace had a part go out, and with the baby coming, we're trying to build the savings back up." I thought these could help. I put my hand over hers on the table. I did not say anything. There was nothing to say that would have been adequate. She sold them that afternoon for $240. She came home with groceries, and she made a pot roast. And at dinner she talked about the baby's nursery and whether she wanted yellow or green for the walls. She never mentioned the earrings again. I went to bed that night and I thought about my older sons. I thought about Patrick's home office renovation and Greg's wire transfer offer. And then I thought about a woman selling her grandmother's pearls to feed a man she had known for 5 years, carrying that man's grandchild, sleeping on a pull-out couch, and talking about paint colors at dinner. I thought about what it means to have enough and what it means to give. I have done a great deal of useful thinking in my life, mostly about load-bearing structures, drainage systems, stress tolerances. I have never done harder thinking than I did in that borrowed bedroom in Asheville, North Carolina, in the middle of May, listening to my son's dog snore in the hallway. I had spoken with my attorney, a man named James Okafor, before any of this began. James had been handling my affairs for 11 years and had the particular quality I valued most in a professional. He never looked surprised by anything. I had told him what I was doing and why, and he had said, "Harold, I've seen stranger things." I had asked him to hold on making any changes to my estate documents until I called him. I called him on the 5th morning in Asheville, from the backyard while Danny was at work, and I told him I was ready. I asked him to come to Asheville in 3 days. I asked him to call Patrick and Greg and tell them there was an urgent matter regarding my estate requiring their presence. He said he would. I could hear him not asking questions, and I appreciated it. I should tell you what happened when Patrick and Greg arrived, because it mattered how they arrived. Patrick drove up in his Audi with the particular expression he wore to difficult conversations, professional concern, calibrated empathy. Greg took a car service from the Charlotte airport, which told me something about how he'd processed the word estate. They both arrived within 20 minutes of each other on a Tuesday morning, and when they walked into Danny's living room and saw me sitting there looking healthy and composed, something moved across their faces that I recognized as recalculation. "Dad," Patrick said, You look fine." "I am fine," I said. "Sit down." James arrived 15 minutes later. He set his briefcase on Danny's scratched kitchen table and opened it with the clicks that good briefcases make, and he took out a folder that was not particularly thick, but that carried the particular weight of organized information. Danny and Lori were in the kitchen doorway. Lori had her hand resting on the side of her stomach the way she did sometimes, like she was checking in. James laid out what I had. The Charlotte house, which I did not actually have a foreclosure on. 4 rental properties across North Carolina and Tennessee, carrying consistent income. A commercial building in Raleigh I'd held for 17 years. 2 parcels of land in the western part of the state that had appreciated considerably. The retirement accounts. The brokerage account. When you added it together, and James had added it together, the total was somewhere north of $4 million. It was not a television number. It was a real number. The kind that gets built slowly over 40 years of working and deciding and not spending money on things that didn't matter. I watched Patrick and Greg across the table. Patrick had gone very still in the way he went still when he was processing something he hadn't prepared for. Greg had his hands flat on his thighs and was looking at a spot on the table just in front of the folder. I spoke directly to them. "I told you I had lost everything," I said. "You both found reasons why you couldn't help me. You offered me money instead of a room. You offered me facilities instead of your time. I am not telling you this to punish you. I am telling you this because I needed to understand something. And now I do." Patrick started to say something. I held up my hand. "I'm not finished." I turned to Danny, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with his arms at his sides and a look on his face that I couldn't entirely read, not quite understanding yet, not quite anything yet. "You gave me your bed," I said. "Lori sold something that meant the world to her so there would be food on the table. You didn't ask how long I was staying. You didn't calculate what it would cost you. You just opened the door." I had to stop for a moment. I am not a man who stops for moments. I stopped. I've already spoken with James about the changes I want to make to my estate documents, I said. You don't need to know the specifics today. But Danny, you and Lori need to know that you and that baby are going to be taken care of. Whatever comes next for your family, you won't be doing it alone. The room was quiet. Lori had both hands on her stomach now, and her eyes were bright in a way that she was working hard to manage. Danny looked at me for a long moment, and then he looked at the floor, and I watched him take one slow breath, the way a man breathes when he is trying to hold something in that is too large to hold in. Dad, he said. I didn't do any of that for. I know, I said. That's exactly the point. Patrick spoke then. His voice was different from how it had been when I called him in May smaller, and underneath the smallness was something genuine. Dad, I'm sorry, he said. I handled that wrong. I knew it when I said it, and I said it anyway. Greg said nothing for a while. He was looking at his hands. Then he looked up and said, I've been trying to figure out what I would have wanted you to say to me if the situation were reversed. I think I would have wanted you to say exactly what you just said. He paused. I don't know if that makes it better. I told him I didn't know either. I told him that what came next was up to them. That I was not closing doors, I was just making sure I understood which ones had already been closed from the other side. After James left and Patrick and Greg had gone, Patrick to his hotel and Greg back to the airport, I sat on Danny's back steps for a while. The evening was coming in over the mountains the way it does in Asheville, soft and slower than you expect, the light going amber and then pink. Biscuit came out and sat next to me with his considerable weight against my leg, which I chose to interpret as sympathy. Danny came out with 2 bottles of water and sat beside me. We didn't talk for a while. How long were you planning this? He asked finally. About 3 months. He nodded. Took a drink of water. Were you scared of what you'd find out? I thought about that. More scared of not finding out, I said. He was quiet for another moment. Then, Lori's been wanting to tell you something. She wanted to wait until we were past 12 weeks. And then she wanted to wait until she was sure everything was okay. And then, well, I looked at him. It's twins, he said. We found out 3 weeks ago. We've been trying to figure out how to say it. He smiled then, and it was the smile he had as a boy, a little sideways, a little like he wasn't sure he was allowed to be that happy. 2 girls. We're having 2 girls, Dad. I put my arm around my son's shoulders. He leaned into it the way he had when he was small, the way children lean who have always been sure of the arms around them. I thought about Carol. I thought about how she would have cried, loudly, and without any of the restraint I had always admired in her, and found impossible to replicate. I thought about all the mornings I had sat in the Charlotte house not knowing what to do with the quiet. I thought about a pair of pearl earrings in a wooden box. 2 girls, I said. 2 girls. I stayed in Asheville for another 2 weeks. Lori and I repainted the nursery together. She chose a soft, sage green, and I painted the trim while she directed from a lawn chair she'd positioned in the doorway because Danny had forbidden her from standing on anything. We talked about her grandmother, about the farm in Gyeonggi Province, about the particular kind of courage required to cross an ocean with almost nothing. I listened in the way I should have listened to more people, more often, for more years. When I left, I drove the long way back to Charlotte, through the mountains, and I thought about the things you build and the things you believe you're building, and how rarely those 2 things are the same. I had believed I was building opportunity for my sons. I had believed that tuition and deposits and down payments were a kind of love made tangible. Maybe they were. But somewhere in the construction, I had forgotten to also build the expectation of reciprocity, not the financial kind, but the human kind. The kind that shows up at a door with a duffel bag and asks for nothing but a room. That part was on me. I want to say that clearly. Patrick called me 2 weeks after Asheville. Not on Christmas. Not on my birthday. On a random Wednesday in June, in the middle of the afternoon, which I mentioned because it had never happened before. He asked how I was. He asked what I'd been doing. The conversation lasted 40 minutes and covered 3 subjects, none of them money. It was a start. Greg sent Danny and Lori a gift card to a baby supply store. It was not a large amount, but he sent it with a handwritten note, which I know because Lori called me to read it to me, and she was careful about her voice the same way she had been careful about her voice the morning with the earrings. Some things run in the same direction, I've noticed. Tenderness and grief, and the effort to contain them. My granddaughters were born in September. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, and 6 pounds, 14 ounces, respectively. I was in the waiting room for 11 hours, which I spent drinking bad coffee and talking to Danny's colleague from the plumbing company, who had also come to wait and who turned out to have opinions about drainage systems that I found genuinely interesting. When Danny came out to find me, his face was the kind of face that bypasses every description. It was just the face of a man who has been handed something he doesn't yet have the capacity to measure. He walked me in to meet them. Lori was exhausted in the specific, brilliant way of women who have just done something enormous, and she held out her hand to me when I came through the door. I took it. The girls were in the bassinet. 2 of them, small and absolute, already entirely themselves in the way newborns are, like they arrived with all the important decisions already made. I thought about the pearl earrings again. I thought about the wooden box and the careful unwrapping. I thought about a woman who gave away the most precious thing she owned to feed someone else's father, and how that single act had clarified something that 41 years of engineering had not, that the strongest structures are not built from the best materials. They are built by the people who show up. One of the girls opened her eyes. They were the dark, unfocused blue of every newborn, seeing nothing and everything at once. I said hello to her. She didn't say anything back, which seemed about right. Some things don't need a response. They just need a witness. And for the first time in 4 years, standing in a small hospital room in Asheville, North Carolina, with my son and his wife and the 2 small people they'd made, I didn't feel invisible at all. Before we go, I want to ask you something, and I mean it genuinely. Have you ever had a moment where someone who had very little gave you everything they had? I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where you're watching from too. It always means something to know who's out there. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who might need it today. We'll see you next time.